Chapter 39. Cam. After destroying the APC and killing its 3 crewmen, Cam and Darian shuffled along to the east, using an older county road lined with tall, mature cypress trees. This area was not as sprawling as the pastoral fields on the west side of the highway were, which gave Cam a feeling of comfort. The area offered more in the way of cover and concealment in the event they were set upon by the KPA, who he knew would be searching for the culprits who'd burned their APC. The 2 men walked, then jogged, then walked again when their legs threatened to quit on them. Cam wanted to place as much distance between himself and the bright flames of the APC as he could before the KPA reinforcements arrived and began scouring the countryside. He also wanted to remain unseen by people living in the areas they passed through. He felt confident the KPA soldiers would harass and even harm the local citizens in their efforts to gather information about who was killing their men and blowing up their vehicles. He felt a stab of guilt when he thought about the hardships his actions were likely to cause other people living in the area, but fought the feeling back. Everyone was about to share in hardship until they either won or lost the entire country. He possessed no viable manner in which to avoid that eventuality. It was simply going to happen, and his only hope was that whatever atrocities the North Koreans heaped on Americans would help galvanize the locals against this invasion. Placating the invaders in the name of survival was not the answer, and would only lead to more oppression and subjugation. 3 hours after the APC encounter, Cam and Darian were sweat-soaked and stumbling their way through the darkness across gently rolling hills covered in low brush. As they crested a knoll, they spotted the dark outline of a barn less than 300 yards ahead. Cam searched the area with his binoculars, looking for a house, which, in most cases, would have been fairly close to any barn in the area. He found no house in his scan of the countryside, and figured the barn must have been a place some farmer used to store hay and other feed for whatever livestock he kept on the property. The thought occurred to him to head down and get some badly needed sleep in the barn, but then his better judgment intervened. If he'd been looking for a fugitive, where would he be looking? Humans almost always sought some sort of shelter, and since houses and similar structures were preferred sources of shelter, he would have searched every structure in the area. Tonight, he'd be sleeping outside under some bush on the side of a hill on top of dry, hard-packed earth. Let's get some rest. Darian nodded, dropped his pack, and began extricating himself out of all the gear strapped or otherwise connected to his body. When it lay at his feet, he dropped to the ground, opened his pack, and withdrew a blanket. Cam stared at Darian as the other man wrapped himself in the blanket and leaned back against his pack. "You brought a blanket?" "Uh-huh." "You bring 2 by chance?" "Nope." Cam sat down and leaned on his own pack for a moment, thinking. "If we sleep in shifts, can I borrow it when it's my turn to sleep?" Darian pulled the blanket up tighter around his neck. "Yep." Both men were silent for a minute, and then Cam spoke. "I'll take the first watch." Darian just grunted, already near asleep, as his body began shedding the stresses of the day, relaxing and working to rejuvenate itself for the upcoming day. Cam huddled on the cold ground, the chill seeping into his body now that he wasn't exerting himself. The old familiar sensation of being miserable wrapped its arms around him like a long, forgotten friend as he sat staring into the blackness of the night. Marriage, kids, and a warm place to sleep every night had turned him softer than he'd realized. Now, older, wiser, yet more susceptible to the trials and privations of warfighting, he swore softly that he'd suffer through whatever life threw at him if it meant being with Jen and the kids again. With a sniff, he steeled himself against the cold wind whipping at his exposed neck. Nope, he told himself. He wasn't going to even think about comfort or discomfort. The only thing on his mind would be the fight and anything associated with it. The following day, they left their campsite and moved north through the hills. They could see the highway to their left, and as they drew near Santa Rosa, they could pinpoint the fairgrounds from their elevated location in the hills. Cam spent a full 30 minutes glued to the binoculars, studying the layout of the fairgrounds before stowing the optics. There's a lot of dudes and equipment down there. Darian sat next to Cam, his arm wrapped around his rifle, using it to support his upper body. You see her? He gave a long sigh. No, I didn't see anyone except the soldiers. Want to get closer? I do. 2 hours later, the men were closer to the fairgrounds, stopped on top of a hill overlooking much of Santa Rosa and less than a mile from the fairgrounds. Cam got back into the optics and examined the landscape around their hasty hide location inside a clump of dried brush. He wanted to be sure they weren't sitting in the middle of some KPA hotbed before he started looking for his wife. If he died, so did his family. 15 minutes later, he was satisfied there were no immediate KPA threats, and he pushed his gaze out to the fairgrounds. It was late afternoon, and at the closer range, he held his breath as he counted soldiers and their equipment. The fairgrounds property was massive, but only a small portion of it was being used by the KPA. A cluster of buildings stood next to a large horse racing track, and the buildings looked like they were locked down pretty tight with KPA soldiers on every corner. There was fencing that looked like it had been there since before the war started, but the KPA had also erected wire in other areas, denying access through the razor-sharp barricade along with sentries posted roughly every 100 yards. The sentry posts were nothing more than sandbagged fighting positions, but he recognized their effectiveness. The KPA soldiers would have cover from small arms as long as they fought from inside their bunkers. Whoever was attacking would be left in the open as they advanced across parking lots or open fields next to the racetrack. Involuntarily, he laid a hand on the RPG-7 tube. That and other tools like it would be how he leveled the playing field. The more he took in the scene below him, the more evident it became he needed more men and weapons to make any sort of viable attempt at rescuing his family. The certitude sickened him to his core. There was a constant battering impulse to run headlong into battle and fight the evil men who deprived him of his most treasured possessions, but he held fast, knowing deep down the result would be quick, violent, and not in his favor. Mike moved stealthily to the west side of the hotel, wary of any signs the situation might have changed during his brief absence. The Audi was right where he'd left it, complete with its fuel door wide open. The door on the side of the hotel was closed, and from a distance of 20 yards didn't appear to be damaged. He dropped the gear he'd brought next to the Audi and pushed on, rifle held high, pressed firmly to his shoulder. Reaching the door, he found it locked, but that also confirmed no one had kicked it in or otherwise forced it open. Stepping carefully toward the front of the hotel, Mike allowed himself a brief respite while he performed a detailed examination of the grounds and exterior of the hotel's front. He hadn't heard a single sound to indicate anyone was even at the hotel when movement caught his eye. Emily walked through the lobby, her gaze on the mostly glass front. Using the suppressed tip of his rifle, Mike tapped 3 times against the glass and watched as Emily dodged behind the reception desk, ducking out of sight. He hurried to the front doors and pulled, but they were locked tight. He didn't want to call out, but was uncomfortable standing out in the open at the hotel's large wrought iron and glass front doors. "Emily!" he hissed, pressing his face against the glass doors. Her head rose slowly from behind the desk at the sound of her name being called. "Open the doors!" Wide-eyed, Emily stared out for a moment, then rushed across the lobby. Fumbling, she manipulated the lock to let him in. "You scared the hell out of me," she confessed, her face still flushed after being startled. "Any problems since I left?" "No, it's been pretty quiet." "Any vehicles on the road?" She shook her head. "I have some clothes and a rifle. They're out in the parking lot." "Why the parking lot?" "I didn't want my hands full of shopping bags if I ran into trouble here, so I dropped it by the car we took gas from." Together they walked through the hotel to the side door where their equipment was and brought everything inside. Emily led Mike to her room, and he deposited the weapon, ammunition, and clothes on the king-size bed. Salted in with the gear were a few medical supplies, including IV bags, needles, and a small assortment of painkillers. It's not much, but it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. I'll try to raid a hospital before we come back next time to add to your inventory. What exactly are you doing out there? Mike exhaled. Not enough. Can you at least tell me where you're doing not enough? Yeah, I guess I can tell you. We're working in and around a town called Petaluma. Emily gave a little snort at that. You boated here, from Petaluma? Yep. Sobering, Emily shook her head emphatically. No, that's too far. 1 hour? I have to be within 1 hour of you guys or someone will die. I don't know how long it took you to get here, but I doubt it was anywhere near 1 hour. His silence answered her suspicions. I'm going with you. We can find a place close enough to save lives, or I don't help you, Mike, from the United States military. He thought that over and had to admit if he or one of their team were seriously wounded, the more than an hour boat ride would probably only succeed in delivering Doc Emily a corpse. You make a valid point, but my partner needs to hear this from you, not me. Emily's mouth curved into a smile as her eyes danced with mischievous glee that was out of tune with the circumstances around them. And why is that, Mike from the United States military? He won't want to take another person. Our boat is already overloaded. We'll have to take a bigger boat then. Mike looked around the room and wondered why she hadn't assumed residency in one of the larger suites, but didn't voice that. Let's go down to the boat and tell my partner. He paused. What about Pierre? We can ask him, but I don't think he'll want to leave. He's pretty freaked out by everything. Fair enough. She was correct. Pierre adamantly refused to leave. Emily explained as best she could in stilted French, but the man shook his head and gestured around the lobby they stood in, speaking faster than the doctor could follow. Finally, she shrugged. He wants to stay. She gave the Frenchman a hug and followed Mike out to the docks. Once he heard Emily pitch her idea about being closer to their operations, Tim gave Mike a disapproving look. Sensing his reluctance, Emily pointed at the dock. We can take a larger boat if that's what you're worried about. They run? Tim countered, his face showing skepticism. I wouldn't know. You got this old thing going. Can't you do the same with... She searched the dock for a boat bigger than the one Tim sat in. Pointing at a 21-foot skiff moored to the dock, she continued, That one would hold all of us, right? An hour later, Rostam had the skiff running after bypassing a few of the vessel's only slightly damaged electronics. The craft boasted a much larger fuel tank and, therefore, had a longer range and could make the trek from the hotel to Petaluma without the need for scavenging gas. Once the engine turned over, Mike and Tim topped off the boat's fuel tank and then filled the 2 cans for reserves. When everyone and all their gear was loaded, Mike had a sinking feeling that things were going too well. Something bad always happened when things went too well. Hold up, he called out, raising his hand above his head. Cut the engine. We can't go blasting out into the bay while it's still light. Tim shifted around to face him. Why don't we push out to the edge of this channel and then hang tight along the shore? After dark, we can move through the bay and back toward Petaluma. Do you guys think they're mostly in the towns and not out in the country? Rostam asked. Mike nodded. No reason to have the troops in unpopulated areas. Not to mention, I think they're just trying like hell to establish a supply line at this point. I can get us pretty close to the bay by staying on the north side of the channels. We can cut through a couple of the smaller bays like Honker and Grizzly, then just wait until it's dark enough to move out into the open water. Mike scratched at his beard, then turned to Tim. Call Cam and see where he's at. We're going to need his help before we throw everything at the detention facility. He ain't going to like that. I know, but we have orders, and they really are a priority. If they establish a supply line and can get a real handle on controlling this area, it may be impossible to get into that detention area. Emily waved sadly to the lone figure standing on the lawn as they pulled away. Cam and Darian had moved away from their brush hide and were resting under a large oak, their backs pressed against its massive trunk. They'd just finished eating when Cam checked the radio Mike had lent him. He didn't have a watch, but the radio's tiny LED screen did, as long as the little unit was powered up. He powered it on and saw he was fast approaching a window when they might be checking in. They'd been gone for 2 days now, and the Green Berets hadn't checked in yet. He laid it across his lap and leaned back, suddenly aware of how exhausted his body felt, even after a few hours of sleep. His hips ached, and now that he was off them, the bottoms of his feet felt like they'd been burned. His back hurt, as did his shoulders and even his neck. The discomfort wasn't of an injurious nature, but more the feeling of being overused without the proper amount of rest the human body required. 10 minutes later, the radio crackled to life, much louder than Cam would have liked. He quickly fumbled with the volume knobs, trying to reduce the little speaker's decibel output. Tim's voice came over the radio. "Go again for Cam," he said, holding the radio close to his face. He wasn't worried about plain speak or even using his true name with the military encryption the Green Berets assured him the radios had. "What is your location? Over," came the scratchy response. "Overwatch on the detention facility to the east, 1 mile. Move back to the marina for link-up." Cam's face immediately darkened. The marina was actually Lakeville Landing Marina, south of Petaluma, a full day's walk from his current location, and nowhere near the spot Cam wanted to be when he launched his offensive to rescue Jen and the kids. "Say again?" "Move to the marina for link-up," Tim repeated. "Negative. You move to my pause," Cam snapped back. There was a long pause, and then Mike's voice replaced Tim's. "Listen, we have orders, and those come first. Orders are, the refueling depot goes before we do anything else in the region." "Negative. Move to my position and bring the cops." "Sorry, Cam. No can do. And if you go it alone, you're gonna die." "The deal was we meet up here and go after the detention facility." He was pleading now, his voice desperate. Darian stared at him, not saying a word. "Sorry, bro, but if you talk Darian into going with you, you'll be killing him. Make sure he understands that, Cam." His shoulders sagged, and he felt 10 years older sitting there under the giant oak in the grass on a hill more than 2,000 miles from his home in Tennessee. The series of events that led him to that point could not be reversed, and he knew that. But still, he lamented the dozens of decisions he'd made that drove him and his family closer and closer, until they'd finally been sucked under the terrible wheels of war, where they were all being slowly ground to dust. Slowly, he brought the radio back to his face. "What's your mission, Mike?" he croaked. "Hasn't changed, Cam. We destroy the refueling depot, then we go after the detention center." "We'll be at the marina in a day." He turned the radio off. Darian exhaled audibly. "What?" Cam grunted tiredly and glanced over at him. "Nothing, man. For the record, I'd never drag you into something like that without letting you know the risks." Darian's mouth tightened, his face grim. "I think you're doing the right thing. There are way too many soldiers down there for even 6 of us." "Right or wrong, I don't like it," Cam groused. Darian started to get to his feet, but Cam waved him back down. "We sleep for a few hours before trying to walk all the way back to the marina." "Fine with me, but going back will be easier because the marina is on the east side of the slough." Cam just sniffed at that as he rearranged his pack so he could lay his head on it instead of the ground.